So welcome to Off the Books with Bethann and Samantha. And today we have author James Logan here. So he is the author of the Silverblood Promise.
Let me just get a beautiful zoom in of that.
It's shiny.
Isn't it so nice?
If you would like to just tell us a little bit about yourself and
about this wonderful book that you wrote.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. So I'm James Logan. I am the author, as you said, of the Silverblood Promise. Got my own copy here to hold up. This is the UK paperback, which I just love how much the colours kind of pop on this. Obviously, if people are just listening, they won't be able to hear, but like the reds and yellows really pop on this one, and I love it. It's great. But yes, author of the Silverblood Promise, epic. Well, I say epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is such a kind of a broad church, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, broadly, I would say it's probably epic fantasy. Debut that came out last year in April in the UK and May in North America. I think of the Silverblood Promise as kind of, Lies of Loch Lamora meets Indiana Jones is how I've seen people describe it, and I think that's kind of a pretty good way of that gets you about 2/3 of the way there. So I think that's a pretty good sort of elevator pitch, as it were. But yeah, the Silverblood Promise follows Lukan Gardova, who is a kind of lapsed nobleman whose life has kind of descended into gambling and drinking too much and generally getting into all sorts of trouble. And then when he learns that his estranged father has died in very mysterious circumstances, he sets out to find out who killed his father and why. And his father leaves him a mysterious note written in his own blood, because that's obviously really cool, isn't it? And this note then prompts Lucan. He starts him off on his journey, and he ends up going to the city of Sophrona at the southern tip of the old empire. And there he thinks that he might be able to learn some answers. And what happens instead is he gets far more than he bargained for and ends up having all manner of adventures and getting tangled up into a kind of web of conspiracy that might just start a war. So yeah, he gets a lot more than he bargained for. Really, it's my kind of love letter to, I guess, adventure fantasy. I grew up reading and just really enjoying kind of adventure stories of all kinds. And I loved adventure stories. I loved fantasy stories. And so it's kind of almost inevitable that the two collided and came together in this book. But really, I just wanted to throw everything into it that I just really, all the kind of things that I enjoy. So like daring escapes, exciting sword fights, chases, snarky sidekicks, cool world building, cool magic. Just it's really kind of just a full-on ripping yarn, and I make absolutely no kind of apologies about that. I'm not I'm not trying to sort of write something that's is well, you always want to write something that moves people and is thought-provoking on some level. But I think really my main aim with this was to write something that would give people a really good time. I wanted it to be fast. I wanted it to be furious. I wanted to just really grip people and them to feel that they were just really sort of, gripped by it and are powering through it. And one of the things that quite a lot of readers have said to me actually is that I've had more than a few have said to me that it kind of got them out of a reading slump. They'd been in a bit of a reading slump, nothing had really quite connected with them, and then they'd read this, and it just got them out of that sort of rut they were in. And I love to hear that, especially when they say, "Oh, I burned through it in like 2 or 3 days." That's great to hear, because when I hear that, it makes me feel like I have achieved what I sort of set out to do. So which is always great. So yeah, it's really just a love letter to kind of adventure fantasy, and I really hope that if you enjoy books like The Lies of Loch Lamora, for example, hopefully you'll have a good time. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing book. I got a quote from I don't think it's on the US version, but it's on the UK version. We have a quote from Scott on the cover. I think the the US version went to print just before we got the quote.
Okay, yeah.
So so we didn't quite get it, but it's on the paperback, and getting a quote from Scott Lynch was just incredible, because he's just such a great writer. I think if you read the Silverblood Promise, you can probably see his influence on my own work. It's I think it's pretty clear, and so to know that he had read the book and thought it was good enough to give an endorsement to really was quite amazing. That was such a great moment for me. So.
It's on my copy at home because I have the paperback. Yeah.
Cool.
This is awesome. So
I like what you said about reading for fun, because I do like a thought-provoking book, but my favorite is to just go in and it's like a whole adventure.
Yeah. because you want to be captivated, and it really does captivate you. And was looking through a bunch of different like interviews and stuff like that you had done, and a lot of people, and even like different blogs that had just read the book and interview or like reviewed it on their own, were saying that it's something that they're calling like a mystery fantasy.
Yeah.
And so I was like, that is actually really wonderful. How do you feel? How do you feel about that? Because it
Like
really does.
mystery fantasy.
Yeah.
I quite surprised because I didn't mean it to be a mystery fantasy at all. But
Fair enough, yeah.
interestingly, I think the Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett came
Oh,
out
yes.
similar kind of time to Silverblood, and people have really gone wild for that as well. And that's very much a mystery fantasy. And so I have seen people mention that and also mention Silverblood and kind of be saying, oh, is mystery fantasy sort of a thing now? Is it having kind of a moment? But
it must be.
Maybe it is, but for my part at least, it was not really intended. I love mystery stories, like I love mysteries, and you know, but it was never my intention to actually set out and write a book. I didn't sit down and say, hey, what I want to do is, you know, write an adventure fantasy, but also have a mystery. I don't know. The book I worked on the book for so long, and so many, you know, it took me like 7 years to write the book, and a lot of the ideas that were in the book were even sort of in my head for a long time, even before that. So sometimes in interviews it's quite difficult because people will say, where did this idea come from? Where did that idea come from? And the honest answer is, I have no idea. It's been for as long as I can remember. Where it first came from or how it first kind of gestated in there or whatever, I have no idea. The mystery element, I think, I think on some level I just thought it would be cool if you know, his father, Lukan's father, was kind of, you know, murdered by unknown assailants, because it just creates that little bit of mystery. But then it kind of, that obviously has just become, I never really thought about it, but obviously that's become a much bigger thing for the wider series. And then also I think because I very much wrote the book to be the start of a series, but also to kind of stand on its own as much as possible. And then it just kind of so happened that the actual plot for this individual book also ended up having an element of mystery in it as well. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything, but you know, there are mystery elements in that, within that kind of individual book plot as well as the wider series. But that wasn't really intended either. I think these things just naturally shook out in the kind of the writing process, I guess. And you know, I did so many passes on the book, and each time just refined the book a little bit more, and I guess teased out these more kind of mystery elements within it. So the short answer is it wasn't intentional at all, but I'm kind of happy that it turned out like that. And a lot of people seem to have actually really enjoyed the mystery kind of elements as much as the kind of more traditional fantasy elements, you might say. So I think it turned out all right, even if it wasn't intended.
Oh yeah, it's great. It makes me think about how, like you were saying about how like it may be a new thing, because romantasy obviously has taken the world by complete storm.
Yeah.
And there has been a lot of debate around, especially in like different like booktubers and stuff like that, that regular like epic fantasy is kind of like dying out in publishing a little bit, and that a lot of people are like self-publishing and stuff like that. And so to be able to see this, especially me being
an
epic fantasy lover. That's my favorite. Yeah. I was so excited because I was like, oh, this is what I want. Something that grips you and like kind of pulls you through the whole book, and like you're on this like journey. It just, you know, like, you know, the OG Hobbit, you get on this trail and you go forward to some goal, and it just does something to you. So how do you feel like in maybe publishing or something like that, that they're kind of overlooking epic fantasy and going more towards romantasy at all? Or like, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think is the answer. I mean, I work in publishing for my day job, so you know, I am on very much on. I'm in the interesting position of having a foot on both sides of the kind of publishing fence, as it were. So as I work as both an editor within the science fiction and fantasy genre, but I also am an author as well. So I see the industry from both sides, which is quite an interesting position to be in. But I think for sure, I mean, firstly, I think the thing to say is I feel like epic fantasy has always, people have always felt that epic fantasy has been dying for a long time. I remember this
Oh,
exact same conversation like 10 years ago. Before I came into publishing, I remember I was very active in the blogging scene because blogging was such a big thing back then. Not so much now. It's obviously more about YouTube and TikTok and things like that and Instagram. But, you know, back when blogging was really sort of popular and taking off and becoming quite significant in terms of like, I think publishers were starting to realize that bloggers could actually, you know, were like to some extent a publicity tool for them or a marketing tool. But I remember that conversation discourse around that time, and very much people feeling that epic fantasy was dying. So it's not a new sort of argument. I don't think it's dying at all. I think there is a really huge readership for the genre. I think what has happened is the moment romantasy is just having a real moment. And these things always come in cycles. I remember, you know, I came into publishing in 2010, so that was when Twilight was like huge.
Oh,
so like, you know, Twilight was like urban, well, what we call urban fantasy. I think these days we tend to call it contemporary fantasy. But honestly, there's so many different subgenres now. It's hard to kind of put labels on all of them. But what we used to kind of call urban fantasy, you know, was just massive because of Twilight. And, you know, but these things always come and go in cycles. And I think at the moment, like a few years ago, sort of mythic retellings, Greek myths and so on were like, that seemed to be the hot thing. I don't think we had loads of them, and now a couple of years later that's maybe not, they're not quite so prominent as they were. And romantasy and also kind of cozy fantasy as well has also just really suddenly exploded and is having a moment. I don't think by any means that epic fantasy is dying or that it's not popular. I think there is a huge fan base for it, and certainly some of the you know, the books that I work on like with authors like John Gwynne is one, and Anthony Ryan are both authors that I work with in my day job, and they both sell extremely well. I know they have really big audiences. So there is a huge audience for epic fantasy. I think it's just that romantasy is just the hot new thing at the moment. And it's great to see, you know, the kind of the science fiction and fantasy genre like moving in different directions. It's great to see the market changing and different things kind of having a moment in the sun. It won't always be like this. At some point, I mean, it does already feel like the market is getting quite saturated with kind of romantasy. So at some point it'll change and there will be a reaction, but I'm not surprised to see this kind of fantasy being popular at the moment, because we, you know, grimdark, so to speak, you know, to use that particular label, that kind of dark, gritty fantasy was very popular for a very long time. And it was inevitable that there would at some point be a reaction against it, people just deciding actually we want something that maybe feels a bit more hopeful, a bit more kind of escapism rather than just like relentless misery. And also I think the world changed dramatically. Well, I mean, I was asked at an event recently whether kind of world events kind of had manifested in my work, and my answer to that was kind of like, how could they not? I mean, I started writing Silverblood in 2015. The world was an incredibly different place in 2015 as to where it is now. And it's impossible to like for those world events not to seep in some way. And I think to some extent people, maybe readers just got a bit they wanted more hope. They wanted more escapism in their reading because the world had got so dark. They don't want to read books where miserable things happen as well. They want books where more exciting, happy, more optimism kind of happens. So I think that's partly pivoted, you know, why people have pivoted to some extent towards you know, romantasy and kind of more cozy fantasy. I think though that, you know, to answer the question, yes, I think epic fantasy does still have a massive readership. I just think the difference is at the moment, not too many publishers are actually kind of looking for it. They're looking to publish, you know, because ultimately publishing is a business, and you know, romantasy is kind of where it's at the moment. And so I feel both as an author as an editor, I do feel that the epic fantasy crowd, of which I count myself one of them, is not necessarily being particularly well served by traditional publishing at the moment. And I think a lot of readers are having to go to sort of indie world, you know, like Kindle Unlimited, self-publishing world, indie authors, because that's where there's a lot of epic fantasy that does really well, and some of them have built really big audiences for themselves. And it is a problem for publishers because you know, me speaking with my editor hat on, kind of thinking about I want to buy epic fantasy books and publish them, it is a bit of a problem if I'm not really being sent them by agents all of a sudden, because agents are more interested in sending other things, and it's difficult to publish. So I end up in a position where it's like, I want to publish books for this audience, but I'm not really seeing many of them coming into my inbox. And how can you serve that audience when you're not finding the kind of the books to kind of publish for them. So, and
Right.
also, how do we reach them if people are receiving newsletters that seem to be like 80% focused on something that they're maybe not as interested in? What will they keep reading our newsletters? Will they move away and just start focusing on independent publishing and so on? So these are all things that we think about and talk about. And on the publishing side, I think as editors, we all realize the importance of trying to cater for all audiences. But it's amazing how diverse the landscape is now. It's so much more diverse, not just in terms of authors of color as well and from underrepresented backgrounds, but also just in terms of the types of books we're seeing. Like when I started in publishing, it was very much like you kind of had your space operas, you had your epic fantasies, you had your urban fantasies with your werewolves and vampires and whatnot. And that kind of blurred the line with paranormal romance a little bit. And that was kind of it. Like you'd occasionally get something that came along and didn't really fit into one of those. And obviously you had YA as well, as it was then. And occasionally something would come along that didn't really fit into one of those categories. But by and large, you could fit most of the books we saw and published, would fit in one of those three categories. Whereas now it's just exploded and it's such a much more diverse landscape in terms of the kind of books that are out there and the kind of reading experiences. And I think it's also, sorry, I'm really just kind of going off on a tangent now and just sort of talking.
It's great.
I think also it's a younger generation of readers coming through that have grown up reading fanfic, maybe in a much bigger way that my generation did, because I'm sort of older millennial, so in my 40s. I didn't really grow up reading fan fiction. It wasn't really a thing because the internet wasn't really a thing. Like, when I was getting into fantasy, the internet obviously existed, but it was in its infancy and you didn't have massive fandom communities and fan fiction communities. But I think now you have a younger generation that have grown up reading that stuff. And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of like tropes now, like books that are really kind of trope heavy. We're seeing books marketed by which tropes they have in them, which I still find quite unusual because the less I know about a book, the better, as far as I'm concerned. I find it quite strange to kind of people want to know everything that happens in the book and all the different tropes before they actually read it. It's kind of whatever works for them. It's not for me to judge, but so it is really super interesting, I think, and how diverse this genre is now and how many different reading experiences there are. But it does, it can make it maybe more difficult to kind of reach your intended audience, I guess, particularly if you're writing some epic fantasy, which isn't necessarily the hot thing at the moment. And I do think it affected. It had an impact when we went out on submission with the book, which would have been like 21. I think it was 2021 we went out on submission with it. It was quite hard we got a lot of the same responses, and all the responses were most of the responses we got were along the lines of, this is really good and we really like it, but it's just kind of not what we want right now. That's quite frustrating because when you get it the first couple of times, you think, okay, well, this is fine. Like sooner or later, someone will want it and will be good. Yeah. But then when you have like 10 or 12 and they all say the same thing, you get to the point where you realize this book isn't going to sell. And it's not because it's not a good book. It's just because it's not landing. It's not kind of the thing editors want right now. And that's quite a hard place to be in, to know that you've written a good book that no one wants simply because it's not the thing they want to see right now. If people are coming back and saying it doesn't work, or this part isn't good enough, or it just isn't ready. You can
specific feedback,
right?
You can take that and you can go away and say, okay, the book just isn't good enough, or it's not this or it's not that, and I need to work and become a better writer. And it's a bit disappointing, obviously, but at least you feel you have something constructive to work with. Whereas when people are coming back to you and saying your book's really good but we just don't want it, that's quite difficult. It's tough, but I think that's kind of just a reflection. I think if we'd gone out maybe even just 2 or 3 years earlier, I think it could have been different. I think we may have had a different response, but that's just how the market changes. So much of it is about timing, and you can't really control it. But fortunately, things kind of worked out in the end, and we got the book out there, and it seems to be doing well, and people are enjoying it, and that's the main thing for me. I'm just thrilled that people are enjoying the books. It's awesome.
Yeah, I was wondering if because you said you were an editor, it got me wondering, like, how did that make you feel knowing that you were in those positions for other people, and then now you're like, it's like reversed. Yeah. And it's like, what kind of pressure like that?
It's a really good question, and it made me realize, I think, something that maybe editors, because editors are so busy, we have too much to do, not enough time to do it in, and you obviously want to do right by the authors whose submissions are being sent to you, but sometimes it does take you a while to get back to it. But one thing I learned from being on the other side of the fence and being the author in the submission trenches was that a week when you're the author waiting to hear news on your book and waiting to see if anyone's going to offer, a week feels like an eternity. When you're an editor and you get an agent chasing you and going, oh hey, I sent you this book like 4 months ago and you've have you looked at it yet? And you think, it wasn't 4 months ago, was it? And then you check the email and you're like, oh wow, it was 4 months. And like it just disappears because you're just so busy. It just disappears.
So much.
But yeah, when you're the author in the trenches on submission, it just feels like every week is an eternity, and it just feels like such a long time. And so it really made me realize, wow, we do really need to try and be better at getting back more quickly and also communicating more quickly. I remember one of the things my agent at the time said, she kind of said, like, just, I remember her complaining, like sort of just not complaining, but just sort of commenting one time and saying how so many of the submissions she'd sent just hadn't had a response. And that's, you don't even know if the editor has seen it or not. Like, did it go into the junk file? And so that again, also that made me realize we need to like not only try and get to things more quickly, but also be good at communication and let people know, because ultimately someone has put their heart and soul into writing a book and spent many months and years working on it, and we kind of owe it to them to give them a fair hearing and try and give them a kind of do it as promptly as possible. So I think the overall process made me hopefully more like, I like to think I'm a very empathetic person and editor anyway, but I think it did give me an insight into what it is like, what the process is like. It is an emotional roller coaster going through that submission process, and I think knowing what it's like made me a more kind of empathetic editor, I like to think. But also I would say the other way around, my background in the industry and my kind of knowledge and experience of the industry, I think one of the questions I do sometimes get asked is like, how did it help you kind of from the writing side, you being an editor in the industry, how did that help you in terms of getting a book deal and things like that? And I would say like obviously I have quite a lot. I've been in the industry like 15 years almost, so I know a lot of people. I have a lot of contacts, and obviously, like any other industry, the more people you know, kind of
easier it is.
It's like any other industry. It's really quite simple. The thing is, it's always about the book. Like knowing lots of people and being like a known quantity, it doesn't mean anything if the book sucks that you've written. Like no one's going to go, well, we really like you, and we know you're a fellow professional in the industry, so we'll buy your book even though it sucks. Like that just doesn't happen. It does not happen. The book has to be good. So I think the main way that being a sort of in the publishing industry to start with has helped me as a writer was simply it helped me manage my own expectations. And I think this is one of the hardest things as editors we have, is you're always trying to manage your author's expectations and try to kind of not let them get too carried away and stuff, and just try and give them an idea of like how things might pan out, and just manage expectations. And because I've been in the industry for such a long time, I had an idea. I know I have a good idea of how things work. I know that things will inevitably go wrong at some point. It just happens. It's no one's fault. It just happens. And so from that point of view, I kind of knew what the processes are like and how, timing is so important. And that's something that no one can really do anything about. So I think it just mentally, it kind of, while I did find the submission process quite challenging on an emotional level, it is tough. But once we got through that and into the actual publishing part of the publishing of it, just having that grounding in the industry and knowing how things worked and just helped me manage my own expectations. And so when sort of the odd thing did go wrong, because things always go wrong, it didn't kind of come as a big shock. It was kind of like, oh, okay, cool. So that's happened. Okay, well, never mind. Let's just try and fix it. And I think that's the main way I benefited from it, is just coming into it
cemented you more, maybe.
I came into it with my eyes wide open because I know how the industry works. And that's not to say I'm some kind of expert. I'm very, very skeptical of anyone who thinks they're an expert in publishing, because we're always learning new things. There's always more to learn. But I just, knowing how it functions and stuff, and the different forces that kind of can have an impact on the process, I think was really beneficial to me. And I sometimes forget that new authors usually don't have that, because I'll send an email to an author and I'll say, this is so good news, this thing has happened. And then they'll be like, sorry, what does this mean? And they'll point out some jargon that I've used. It's like, oh, of course, you don't know what that means. So it's just simple things like that. It made it a smoother process for me, I think, is the main way in which I would say.
Awesome. So you said it took you 7 years to write this book?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I know you talked about like the publishing process a little bit, but do you have any like, because when we've talked to our other authors that we've interviewed, they have very different and specific writing processes, like
Yeah.
how they start their
Yeah.
books, like
Yeah.
they're like little rituals. Do you have anything that you have to do when you write a book, or do you have a specific way that you start writing?
I'm still learning how to write books. This is the crazy thing. Yeah, I mean, the reason the first book took me 7 years was because I didn't really know what I was doing. I've written fiction or tried to write fiction since I was a teenager. I started writing when I was about 15, and very quickly decided that this is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to be an author and write epic fantasy books. But yeah, it took me from then until now, like the better part of 25 years, to actually do that. But yeah, it took me 7 years to write this book because I just didn't really know what I was doing, and I was having to pretty much learn my process as I was going. I was having to learn what kind of things worked for me, what kind of things didn't work for me, and I realized quite quickly that a lot of the writing advice on the internet is not really worth paying attention to because it assumes a one size fits all kind of approach, which is not how writing is. Writing is a very organic, very natural kind of process, and everyone, I think, just has to figure out what works for them. So like my partner is a writer and she writes in a very, very different way to how I write. She will start in the middle and then go back and then go forwards, and she will jump around the manuscript and write whatever she feels compelled to write in that moment, whatever she feels she needs to write in that moment. Whereas I will very much write chronologically, and I will write 95% of the book in that way. But yeah, it took 7 years because I was trying to figure it out, and I just learned various lessons. Like if I was having a tough time and the words weren't quite flowing, I would get quite sort of frustrated with it. I would be stubborn. I'd be like, I'm gonna beat this. I'm gonna do it, and I'd try and sort of bulldoze through it. And then I remember one day, like one particularly bad day, when I literally spent about 5 hours in front of the screen and came away with about 600 words, and just remember how demoralized I felt at the end of that. But it was a process of learning, and now I know, years later, if I'm having a hard, tough day, and to be honest, it doesn't happen very often these days, but if I am having a hard time and it's not quite working, I know that the best thing I can do is just step away from it, leave it for the day, or just leave it for half an hour. And I know that because I know now when I get stuck, it's because something isn't right. I am either approaching the scene from the wrong angle, or I am not starting at the right point in the scene, or something is missing from it. My subconscious knows that, but my consciousness hasn't caught up with it yet. So I just have to give it time to do so. And if I go away, go for a walk or something, my brain will always figure out what the problem is, and then I come back and I can just move forwards. But that was something that took me a long time to learn, that particular process. So and because one of the things I never did over the years, I never got past about the halfway point of a manuscript. So I would, get halfway through a manuscript and then I'd be like, oh, this isn't working because the main character sucks, or this isn't very good, or I don't know what I'm doing. And I just toss the whole thing out and start again. So, and that's one of the worst things you can do as a writer, because you need to learn how to write a book from start to finish, right? You need to learn how to tell the whole story. I got really, really good at telling the first third of a story, but then never got anywhere past that. So Silverblood was the first book I've written all the way through from start to finish. And again, that's another reason it took me so long, was because I'd never done it before. I'd never told the whole story arc. So I kind of smashed the first part of it, was like, great. And then realized I had to do the rest. And it's like, I have no experience doing that. I have no experience trying to balance plot lines against each other, or bring the character arcs to where they need to be. So I was having to learn this all on the fly. And that's what, and the only way it kind of got it to work was basically to just revise and revise over and over again. I must have done like 7 or 8 passes on the book, and that was before it even went to my agent. So it was just a huge amount of work and a huge amount of revising. And even with the second book now, which I'm working on and I'm nearly done with, I'm learning. I kind of came into this thinking, well, I've done it once, I know I can do it, so surely the second book will be easier. But I think I've actually found it harder, or at least the drafting was easier. The first draft, I did that, didn't have too many problems with the first draft, but the revision, the second and third drafts have been really, really quite challenging. And again, it's because I'm still learning. Like the first book is very pacey. It's kind of like action and excitement and kind of things being set on fire, and crash bang wallop, kind of out of the frying pan into the fire kind of stuff. The second book is, I don't want to say slower, because that makes it sound like it's slow and boring, and it's really
Right.
not. But
Yeah.
it takes a bit more of a breather, and it doesn't kind of like just fly out of the trap straight away. It eases into it a little bit more, and it's also a little bit more introspective because I realized I was like, oh, wait a minute. So the first book, these characters get thrown together and they're just kind of going along with for the ride and figuring it out as they go. This second book, I need to think about the dynamics of their group. What do they think about each other? How are they getting on? How does that impact? Where is the conflict in this? Where is the tension? And how does that manifest? And what does it do? And how does it relate to the storyline? And how does it relate to their character arcs? And I kind of thought, it's cool. I'll figure it out as I go. And then kind of didn't. And then sort of, so the main feedback I got on the first draft was like, this is really good, but like some of the character arcs just don't make sense, so, and I knew they didn't really work. And so I was having to figure out like, and I think writers have different kind of toolboxes, as it were. I think all of us are good at different things. I would say like handling character relations and figuring out these arcs and stuff is not something that necessarily comes as naturally to me as maybe other things do. I have to really think about it and really work at it. And so that's why I found the second book quite challenging, because I was having to do all of this character work, which I hadn't had to worry too much about in the first book. I mean, there is kind of, there is some in there. There are some quieter moments when, we have these moments of character development, we explore their backgrounds a little bit, and we have them interacting and so on and so forth. But for the second book, I had to do more of that, and that was something I found really challenging. And so again, I was having to learn how to do that, having to develop my skills in this kind of area of writing. And so yeah, I mean, in terms of process, like it's quite simple for me. I just sit down and I try to write as much as possible. I try not to have like designated kind of days when I write. I will just kind of see how it goes, but I will try to write as much as I can. But I also have I tend to try and take Saturdays off when I can, because I can't burn out. I have burned out before writing the second book, and it is tough when you get into that space to get out of it again and get your creativity back. So it's about balance, but it's difficult because you always feel like you should be doing more. And it's difficult. But you have to say to yourself, no, I know I'm on deadline. I know I have a lot to do, but I have to take this day to recharge, because otherwise I'll be useless tomorrow. So I try to write as often as I can without burning out. I don't try and hit a word count. I've tried that before. Like Stephen King's advice was like, write 1,000 words a day. And it's like, boy, I tried to do it. I tried to do 500 words a day. And like after about 2 weeks, I hated my book. I hated myself. Hated everything, so it just didn't work for me. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about like, you have to ignore most writing advice and figure out what your own process is. So like I don't chase word counts. I just try and do what I can in the hour and a half that I have, and I trust that over the course of a year it'll aggregate into something meaningful. And I just concentrate on the next 500 words that I'm doing. I try not to think too much about, because if it's like climbing a mountain. If you look up and see how far you have to go, you think, oh my God, I'm never going to do it. And when you do get high up, if you look down, you see how it's the opposite. So I just try and concentrate on like the cliff face right in front of me, as it were, to kind of extend that kind of metaphor a bit further. Just think about the next 500 words, and then when you've done that, think about the next 500 words. And I find also that that's quite a helpful approach, because if you try and think, I want to try and introduce something new every 500 words, whether it's whether it moves the scene on, or whether it's a new character, or whether it's a bit of excitement that happens. If you think of it in 500 words, it just means you're always constantly trying to insert new things into the book, and just keeps the pace going. So even if it's a quieter kind of scene, I think that's a good way of just trying to inject some pace into it and keep things happening. So yeah, that's really like, the short answer really is I'm still trying to figure out my processes and things, but I'm starting to get there, and I'm starting to kind of understand what is involved in writing a book and how I personally go about it, which is probably very different to many other writers, because we're all different.
Yeah, I was about to say, everybody is so different. And like the more we talk with people, and the more like I learn about being an author, the more like when people have that dream and like that vision to be an author, I'm just like, I am here to support you all the way. Like it is so difficult, because like you were saying, you micromanage the lives of every single person here. Like you have to like kind of essentially know a billion people, and you're just this one person, like stringing together all of these different personalities and all these different decisions, and you have to know you're like God in this whole universe, like creating this whole piece. And when you look at it, like you said, like that, it is so daunting, because how can I sit down and say, I want to do this, and then I automatically think of Oh no, it's so much.
And then you have
Yeah.
you have a deadline, and
Yeah.
I know for me, I don't think I could ever be an author because I am the person that's like, oh, it's due on the 8th. Okay, I'm
I'll
gonna do it
sit
on the
down.
7th.
Yeah, I
Obviously,
mean,
we're not good at options to be authors, but you guys do a lot.
Yeah.
yeah, I no, it is a lot, and I think, fantasy in particular, like secondary world fantasy, it's one of the things that I realized was a question always leads to another question. So
Yeah.
so you have a question, you're like, okay, I need to figure out like this particular thing, and then you figure it out, but then that answer just kind of then prompts more questions, and
Yeah.
even the smallest things, like yeah, you just there is just so much to figure out, like even yeah, it's I mean, just it's I suppose it's just you're creating a world, and if you want it to be convincing and feel authentic, you have to think about the small things. And I really think that this
Yeah.
is something I say quite a lot, but I really think that world building, or the best world building, it's not in the big sweep of the world. It's not in like the kind of, I think a mistake that a lot of less experienced writers make is they think world building is about kind of like famous battles and events and people's
Oh,
names and like
Yeah.
yeah.
the history of the world. It's not really. It's great to have that, but really you should never really see too much of it, or you should only see what is relevant to the story, or in order to kind of build up a sense of place as much as you need to. World building really exists in the small details.
Yes.
It's in the little details that you just throw in there and mention briefly. I think I'm a big fan of Christopher Buehlman, like The Daughter's War and The Black Tongue Thief. I think they're really tremendous books, and I ambushed Christopher on the at the Worldcon recently. We were at the tour party, and I was like, I've got to tell him how much I love his books. And I waited until he was like going to the bathroom, and I just kind of like jumped in front of him and was like, Chris, I'm a fellow author. I really love your books; they're awesome. And then just kind of like just spoke at him for like 30 seconds. And I think he was just kind of increasingly like, you could kind of see him thinking, oh my God, it's one of these people. He was very kind. But I just really wanted to take the opportunity. But I think he's particularly great at I think his world building is fantastic, and I love the way he will just, it's the little details. He will mention this person came from a land that was renowned for its horses, and then he'll just like have a couple of lines about the horses, and then that's it. That's all you get, but it's all you need. Suddenly in your head you're like, oh, okay, so that place is the horse place. That's where their culture is around horses, and it's a big thing for them. Another place, another kingdom or whatever, is the one where they have the wine. That's the big thing for them. There's small details, quite simple, and they're just thrown in and then just kind of like they just disappear. But that's how you build a world. It's in these small things. It's not in these kind of long histories that get trotted out, which are just confusing. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it is a lot to keep track of. And I remember particularly with the first book, less so in this one because a lot of the world is already established. So I've done a lot of the heavy lifting already, but definitely in the first book, I just remember like when I was doing the final revisions on it, and I must have had like 100+ comments on the manuscript, and it was just tiny little things like, what is this character's name? Where does this character come from? What is the meaning of this particular thing here? And they're all really small things, but you have to like take your time on them and get them right, because otherwise, you can run into problems later. But yeah, it's a huge amount of work creating a secondary world, and you have so many things that you have to think about, and it is quite exhausting for sure. It's quite a daunting task.
Yeah. For me, like if I'm reading and I can't picture the world, like you said, if they're describing history and nothing that my brain can attach
Connect or
and
Yeah,
build a picture out of,
right.
I'm out of the book. Like I can't.
I agree with that. And I also love like circling back to you and specifically the Silverblood Promise.
Mm,
I am able to see the world and establish the world through the eyes of the characters.
Right.
yeah,
Appreciate that because it gives me an emotional attachment to these places that they've been because they've lived these lives. They've experienced these things. These are their homes of like where they've lived, where they've died, where they've, you know what I mean, like have experienced all these things. And you've written it in such a way where while we're in with these people, we're seeing these people, they're
Yeah.
speaking,
You can connect.
you can
with them.
see
mm,
what's happening, what this world is like, what's going on. And you've done a really fantastic job of you just feel like you're a part of it immediately.
Right.
Like you walk in and you're just like, I'm here and I know what's going on and I feel it and I connect and I love these people's sense of humor and like it's beautiful and you did a fantastic job. Even though it wasn't a
Thank
daunting
you.
job,
Mm.
you did a fantastic job. I love
Well,
it.
I mean, that's very kind, and I'm very pleased to hear that. And I think one of the I guess one of the advantages I have in terms of introducing the world is, and this was something I wanted to do right from the start. When I was first planning the series, and I was doing the embarrassing thing that like wannabe writers do when you're kind of, well, I shouldn't say wannabe writers because I very much think that if you write, you are a writer. There's no such thing as an aspiring writer. It's like you either write or you don't. You're either a writer or you're not. Anyway, I did that thing that a lot of new writers do, I should say, where you kind of go to the coffee shop and hang out and look all important with your
Oh.
notebook. I'm gonna, but
It's
I did
like
all that stuff. But
yeah.
yeah, I did quite a lot of, by fleshing out the world, sort of, sitting in coffee shops and everything. But one of the things I did think about right from the start was I knew I wanted to write a series where the characters like visited a new setting every book, because that not only would it keep it fresh for me and stop me from getting bored, but also it would keep it fresh for the readers if every time it's like we're on to a new place. So that was very much an idea from the start, but I think inadvertently I benefited from that without realizing it, because it's a new place in the first book that the character has been. He has not been there before, and because
Right.
we see it through his eyes. If you're writing a story where the character is in their home city and it's really familiar to them, it's not familiar to the reader, so you have to get that
Right.
across. But the character isn't, if you're writing in the kind of really close sort of third person that I'm writing, where you are seeing through the character's eyes, so to speak, you're kind of in their head, right? That's how I
Yeah.
tend to write. You're in their head and you're seeing everything that they see. The problem is, like, if you're writing a character that is in a familiar setting, they're not going to naturally be looking at the big gateway and going, wow, that's super impressive, because they've seen it a million times. It's like me
Right.
living in London. All the tourists are like kind of like
Wow.
staring, wow, cameras out and
Yeah.
looking at the landmarks. I see them every day. I don't even notice them.
Right.
So like you have the problem then of like having to point out all of these things that make this setting interesting, but the character wouldn't even notice them because it's familiar.
Yes.
But for
Yeah.
me, I was fortunate because Lukan is coming to Sophrona. He's never been there before. He is effectively like seeing this for the first time at the same time the reader is seeing it. So that made it quite easy for me to be like, have him kind of like, staring at some impressive building or whatever, because he would be. He's never seen it before. And that just makes it a lot easier. It doesn't feel forced. It feels quite natural. And I think sometimes it's difficult because you have to kind of, force it a little bit. But fortunately, I didn't have that problem, and I didn't have that problem in the second book either, because again, we're in a different place. He's never been there before, and so again, we're seeing it through his eyes for the first time. He's seeing it for the first time. Readers seeing it for the first time. That definitely helped,
Yeah.
create that sense of
Learning
place, that
together.
sense.
Yeah.
Sense of wonder and sense of place, yeah. And sense of wonder is something, incidentally, that I always look for in kind of not just fantasy but like science fiction as well. Like I really love to see, I really love books that really create that sense of wonder, and it feels like a kind of a different place. And one of the things maybe I struggle with I'm not I don't want to say I'm not a grimdark fan as such, but I'm maybe not. One of the things I struggle a little bit with novels that kind of are described as grimdark is they quite often lack the sense of wonder, because they're much more about just the gritty kind of nihilism of it all. And it's like I actually want the sense of wonder. I want the big sprawling vistas and the kind of impressive things that really make you feel like you are in a different world. I don't necessarily want to read something that feels much more similar to our own, maybe kind of earlier historical periods. It's just me though.
Right.
That's just my personal preference. But
I love it. I really do. Like I agree with you. And when people, because you said it was compared to the Lies of Locke Lamora, and I started it up, and I was like, yeah, like I get, like when you're saying like all of the big world that it's in, and like meeting all of these different characters, and even all the humor and stuff. I love a good sense of humor in a book. I
yeah,
love
so
it.
do I. So do I. So do I.
So great. And then like,
It's really important. It's just really important to me. I think, sorry to interrupt, but it's just
okay.
kind of while I think of it, it's something that maybe was missing from the books I read when I was growing up, because I grew up reading the big fantasies of the 1990s,
Yeah.
so like Terry Brooks, Ray Feist, Robert Jordan, Tad Williams, all of
Yeah.
these kind of, and
The,
they're fantastic and I love them, and
oh,
there's so many qualities they have, but like an obvious sense of humor wasn't always one of them, and I feel that's much more modern kind of sort of that's more of a something that has crept into fantasy in since the kind of 2000s, I think. Like Liza Locklamora, also Joe Abercrombie in The Blade itself, and his sort of books as well have that really dark humor in them. And yeah, I feel like that's more of a modern, something more modern that has crept into fantasy in more recent years, and I'm very happy about that because I love a good sense of humor as well. I'm definitely here for it, and that was something I really wanted to capture in my own work as well. I think it's just really important as well, because it's a very human thing, isn't it? I think it's a big
Yeah.
part of the stories that we tell, and I think people who are even in I mean, even in like the trenches in World War One, they're telling they're telling jokes, you know, like it's humor is such a part of the human experience, and I think you have to have it on some level. But it's about getting the balance right, I suppose. It's always about balance.
Do you have any book recommendations for people that really love the Silverblood Promise?
I know
Or
you
just any like personal book recommendations that you yourself
would
really
like
love?
to just push out there and get people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I really I love Scott Lynch's work. I think I talked about Scott enough. But I really love his work. I think that's fabulous, and I'm really happy that he is kind of back to, you know, being active and putting out new work is fantastic to see. He's got some new stuff coming out this year, and I'm super excited about that. I love Jay Kristoff's work, the Nevernight Chronicles. I think it's Nevernight Chronicles. And also Empire of the Vampire. I really think that's particularly Empire of the Vampire. I think is a tremendous kind of modern epic fantasy. I think done like it's about as good as it gets, really. But I love the humor in his work, but also just the depth of the world building and the great characters and the writing. I think is really strong. I love Chris Wooding Retribution Falls, which came out quite a while ago, but that was another series which is kind of like a ripping yarn and has a huge amount of humor in, and that was another kind of big influence on me as well. And yeah, I mean those are the kind of adventure sort of those are the kind of things that I think are most sort of similar, I guess, to Silverblood. It's the kind of authors that I like to read with a good dose of action and adventure and humor and so on.
So, the Silverblood Promise is the first book in the series. How
Huh?
long is your series going to be going? Can you
I
tell us?
I've been
Spoilers.
I've been very careful not to describe it as a trilogy because it isn't a trilogy.
Okay.
I think I was originally thinking five, and then I just thought this is my editor hat coming on, and like it's too ambitious. You can't just the 5 books is quite a lot to ask for a debut author. So I'm gonna try and do it in 4. I think it's gonna be I'm hoping it'll be a quartet. The trouble is I haven't planned out the wider series. I'm very meticulous when it comes to planning each individual book, but I haven't really thought about the wider series. So I don't know. I have not, people assume that I know how it ends. I haven't got a clue. I don't really know. I don't really
I love
know
that.
where it's going. I'm kind of finding out as we go. I've got like vague ideas as to how book 3 goes and what happens in it, but I need to do a proper plan. But book 4, I have no idea. I'm really hoping that it's going to be 4 books. I don't know. That's what I'm aiming for. Quartet, hopefully. So
Awesome. And then what is the name of your second book that's coming out? And do you know
the second
what
book
about?
the second book is The Black Fire Blade, and that is coming out in November this year. So yeah.
I'm excited.
I'm putting the finishing touch. Well, there's still a bit of work to do, but I'm about 90% of the way there with that now. So it's getting there. I've been pushing it really hard. December was a tough month in terms of writing. I was really kind of burning the midnight oil on it, but we're the bulk of the work is done now. We're getting there. So I'm feeling pretty good about it. I'm feeling pretty good.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on here with us and sharing all your
Of
writing
course.
experiences and talking about your wonderful book. And that means everybody in audience land, library land, you need to come pick the book up because we have it in a physical copy and we have it on Libby. So you can, if you don't want to come in because it's cold outside here, it's snowing, unfortunately, you can get it online. On Libby and pick that up. And yeah, this is a great book, you guys. You guys have to pick it up. You guys have to support the author. And if you want to go and buy the book, you should do it. We love it. And we are very thankful for you to come on
Yes,
and
thank you very much.
Thank you
participate
for
with
having me.
us. It's
Really,
such an
really
honor.
appreciate it. It's been a
Yeah.
huge. I love doing these things. I love talking to on podcasts and chatting with fellow fantasy fans and readers. It's always a real delight. So thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.